8 years. That is how long the earth held its breath, how long the air around the small, isolated home in the woods seemed to vibrate with an unanswerable question. 8 years stretched into a profound, aching silence that swallowed the very memory of the Wallace family. Their absence was not sudden in the cinematic sense. It was a slow, creeping drain of hope, a gradual fossilization of a living, breathing mystery into cold, hard folklore. The last confirmed moment of their existence, a sliver of normalcy against the backdrop of an impending abyss, occurred on a Tuesday evening in 2002. It was then that a panicked, breathless call reached the county sheriff's department. Sarah Wallace, her voice a thin, reedy wire of terror barely cutting through the static of a rural landline, reported an intrusion. A shadow, she insisted, had crossed the perimeter of their property, something tall and unnaturally silent, moving with a deliberate, predatory slowness. She spoke of the children, James and Clara, already tucked into their beds, blissfully unaware of the tightening vice of dread that was gripping their parents, Robert and herself. Robert, she managed to relay before the line went dead, was outside, circling the house with a hunting rifle, a futile gesture of defiance against a fear too vast to be contained by wooden walls and thin windows. That was it. The line did not drop. It simply went quiet, a sudden, irreversible snap, severing the voice of anxiety from the world of assistance. The responding deputies, arriving an hour later, a crucial, irretrievable gap of 60 minutes, found a scene of eerie, unsettling order. The front door was unlocked, the porch light on. Inside, the dinner dishes were stacked neatly by the sink, still waiting for the wash water to run. The children's bedroom doors were ajar, the beds still ruffled from their momentary occupants. A teddy bear slumped against a pillow, a silent, furry sentinel of a shattered sleep. Robert Wallace's hunting rifle, the supposed tool of protection, was found leaning against the kitchen counter, unfired, a symbol of a confrontation that never reached the stage of violence. Or perhaps, one that was so swift, so overwhelming, that it rendered the weapon moot. Every wallet, every purse, every key ring was precisely where it should have been. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. The scene was less a crime and more meticulous erasure. It was the absolute, total lack of disturbance that was the disturbance itself. The investigators, seasoned men hardened by decades of small-town tragedy and predictable domestic chaos, were instantly thrown off balance. They expected struggle, they expected a desperate flight, they expected a single, crucial mistake. Instead, they found only a void, a perfect, unnatural vacuum where 4 human lives had been just moments before. The initial investigation proceeded with the kind of frantic, desperate energy that accompanies a sudden, inexplicable vanishing act. Helicopters churned the air above the vast, unforgiving forest that surrounded the Wallace property. Hundreds of volunteers, their faces etched with a mixture of determined hope and creeping dread, formed search lines, combing the undergrowth, calling out names that only the wind seemed to carry. They searched for footprints, for torn fabric, for anything that spoke of an urgent exit. What they found, over weeks and then months, was precisely nothing. The earth had swallowed them whole. The official reports from that initial phase read like a litany of dead ends. The theory of voluntary disappearance was swiftly and brutally dismissed. Robert and Sarah Wallace had secure, stable jobs, no crippling debts, and a social circle that swore by their devotion to their children. They were not the type of people who simply walked away from their life, especially not without a single note, a single withdrawal from their bank accounts, or a single call to a distant relative. The theory of an opportunistic crime, a home invasion gone wrong, also faltered. What kind of intruder would meticulously tidy the crime scene, leave all valuables untouched, and then somehow vanish for people without a trace, a sound, or a witness? This was not the work of a common criminal. It felt like the execution of an impossible design, a story plucked from the pages of a forgotten Gothic horror novel. The investigators were haunted by the image of the rifle, standing uselessly in the kitchen. Did Robert Wallace return inside before facing his unknown assailant? Did he stand there, paralyzed by a silent, overwhelming threat? Or was the entire narrative of the intruder a misdirection, a hastily constructed facade designed to obscure the true, internal mechanism of the family's disappearance? The emotional weight of the case began to settle like a thick, toxic fog over the small community. The grandmother of James and Clara, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, became the living embodiment of the case's tragedy. Her pleas to the media were not histrionics. They were quiet, profound expressions of a mother's unending, terminal grief. She held up blurry, happy snapshots of the children, a boy with a missing front tooth, a girl with unruly, bright red pigtails, and her eyes spoke of the terrible void that no photograph could ever fill. She demanded answers from a universe that had become stubbornly, cruelly mute. Years bled into one another. The Wallace house, eventually secured and then left to the care of a distant, shell-shocked cousin, became a monument to the unsolved. The paint peeled, the windows dulled, and the vines began their slow, deliberate conquest of the structure. It was a tangible metaphor for the case file itself. Once pristine, now decaying, covered in the dust of indifference and the cobwebs of official defeat. The case was moved from active investigation to cold file, a clinical term that meant to the families that hope itself had been officially declared dead. The narrative seemed closed, sealed by the passage of time and the absence of evidence. But a true mystery, a truly profound and disturbing hole in reality, never truly closes. It merely hibernates. And in the 8th year, a new lead, a piece of forensic debris picked up almost by accident, would finally break the terrible, hypnotic silence. The moment of discovery, the sudden, violent shattering of all prior assumptions, arrived not through a brilliant piece of detective work, but through an almost mundane administrative review. A newly assigned detective, a young, relentlessly methodical woman named Detective Anya Sharma, was cycling through the older cold cases, a tedious, bureaucratic requirement. She was looking for patterns, for connections to other unsolved rural disappearances, an act of sheer hope against the mountain of statistical probability. She paused on the Wallace file, not because of a new clue, but because of the sheer, impossible tidiness of the original scene. It was the rifle, she later admitted, leaning against the counter, that arrested her attention. Why would a father, preparing for a home invasion, leave his only defense weapon inside the house, unsecured, while venturing outside? It defied every instinct of a prepared man. This led her to reread Sarah Wallace's breathless, fragmented 911 call. Robert is outside, circling. If he was outside, and the rifle was inside, the call was likely made after he had gone out. But then, why did he come back in to put the gun down, only to go missing immediately after? Or did he never go outside with it at all? The entire timeline, based on a single, terror-laced statement, began to unravel. Sharma decided to visit the house, a rite of passage for all detectives who inherit a sleeping giant of a case. The property, she observed, was less a house and more a mausoleum, choked by kudzu and the suffocating atmosphere of forgotten tragedy. As she walked the perimeter, her eyes, trained by years of observation, caught something the original team had missed, something too small, too unremarkable to register in the immediate frenzy of a search operation. Nestled among the dead leaves and thick grass near the back corner of the house, where the roofline met the first-floor siding, was a tiny, faded scrap of plastic, a hard, brittle fragment, no larger than a child's thumbnail. It was white, with a faint, almost invisible smudge of blue. It would have been dismissed as refuse, common plastic litter blown in from the road. But Detective Sharma felt a sharp, unshakable intuition. She collected it, bagging it with the reverence due to a golden relic, and sent it to the state lab. The results, a week later, were a slow-motion explosion. The fragment of plastic was identified. It was a piece of a child's toy walkie-talkie antenna, specifically the base of a novelty radio set sold nationwide in the early 2000s. The blue smudge was, astonishingly, a trace of James Wallace's blood, confirmed by a long-dormant DNA sample from an old toothbrush. The implication was immediate and horrifying. One of the children had been outside the house, or at least near the exterior wall, possibly dropping the toy in a moment of fear or confusion. The tidy, internal disappearance narrative, the story of a perfect, silent abduction from within the walls, was instantly, irretrievably shattered. The scene was no longer a vacuum. It was a lie. The children had been involved in the pre-disappearance activity, and the struggle, or the flight, had begun not inside, but precisely where the Wallaces had sought their supposed sanctuary. Detective Sharma refocused the search on the immediate vicinity of the house, no longer looking for a trail away from the property, but for a hidden, internal cavity. Her attention was drawn, almost magnetically, to the one structure that the initial search had largely ignored. The large, rustic stone chimney that rose like a broken obelisk from the center of the house. It was a purely visual intuition, a sense that the key to concealment was not distance, but depth. The original reports mentioned nothing unusual about the fireplace. It was a closed system, a functional architectural feature. Yet, Sharma's logical mind began to process the impossibility of 4 bodies vanishing. An unmarked vehicle, an opportunistic crime. These required transport. But a meticulous, silent, internal disappearance suggested storage. Where do you hide 4 people forever in a small, well-known house? The answer, both physically and psychologically, was a place that was present but unseen. The fireplace. It seemed insane. But as the investigation shifted, as the full gravity of the tidy crime scene sank in, the logic began to assert itself with terrible clarity. The walls and floors had been meticulously inspected. Only the chimney, a vertical conduit of stone and soot, remained a sealed, dark mystery. Armed with the DNA evidence from the toy and a warrant based on an entirely new theory of concealment, a specialized team was dispatched to the decaying house. The moment was heavy with a history of failure, but also with the sharp, almost painful anticipation of a terrible certainty. Under Sharma's direction, the chimney was slowly, methodically dismantled, stone by stone, from the inside out. The air filled with the gritty, acrid smell of old soot, cold stone, and the musty perfume of forgotten history. For hours, nothing but darkness and dust. Then a sound, not a cry, but the grating scrape of a trowel against something unnatural, something that was not stone or brick or mortar. It was a dull, organic thud that echoed with the finality of a closing door. The lead technician paused, his eyes wide, and motioned for absolute silence. They found a crude, makeshift blockage, a stack of ancient, waterlogged 2x4s, 4 sideways into the narrower flue, expertly sealed with a thin layer of quick-drying concrete, its presence completely masked by the century of black soot covering the interior walls. It was a small, crucial, and terrifying piece of architectural deception. This was no casual concealment. This was the work of a person with knowledge, with intent, and with a terrible, dark foresight. The removal of the final blockage was a ceremony of dread. What they saw was a tableau frozen in time, a dark, silent chamber that had become the final repository of a family's history. The terrible silence of the past 8 years was finally broken by the immediate, visceral certainty of what lay within the chimney's throat. The remains of the Wallace family were there. Not just the physical evidence of their passing, but the haunting, articulate testimony of their final moments. Robert Wallace, found at the base, his body wedged, a terrible, final barricade against the rising column of brick and smoke. Sarah Wallace, slightly above him, her arms wrapped around a small, skeletal form. Clara, the girl with the unruly red pigtails, still clutching the tarnished silver locket her grandmother had given her. And James, found separately, higher up, entangled in a coil of thick, brittle rope, a detail that immediately seized the attention of the investigators. The scene defied the initial narrative of a sudden, clean abduction. This was not a quick, silent killing. It was a desperate, terrifying attempt at survival, a final, claustrophobic struggle in the tight, vertical confines of the hearth. It suggested not the act of a single intruder, but a controlled, premeditated execution followed by an unprecedented act of concealment. The assumption of a swift, external crime dissolved instantly. The new, darker line of inquiry began the moment the first forensic photographer's flash illuminated the interior of the chimney. The discovery of the bodies was a cataclysm for the investigation, simultaneously answering the profound, 8-year-old question of where they were, while instantly replacing it with the far more terrifying question of how they came to be there. The preliminary scene analysis, conducted in the stifling, tragic atmosphere of the Wallace home, immediately challenged the concept of a simple, quick murder. The arrangement of the bodies, the physical state of the remains, spoke of a slow, terrifying end. Robert Wallace's body, for instance, showed not the marks of a forceful external assault, but the signs of extreme, overwhelming manual restraint. The fibers found beneath his fingernails were not from a common jacket or shirt, but from a thick, industrial-grade canvas, suggesting he was bagged or bound before his placement. The manner of their death was initially difficult to ascertain due to the advanced state of decomposition, but the medical examiner's eventual findings will be both specific and profoundly disturbing. The cause of death for all 4 family members was determined to be a combination of asphyxia and positional trauma. They had been, the examiner concluded with clinical dread, suffocated and crushed within the tight, downward tapering space of the flue. But the final, most damning detail lay not in the parents, but in the children. James, the boy who had once dropped his walkie-talkie outside, was found with a coil of rope, a thick, hemp-like fiber, entangled around his torso and neck. The rope was not simply near him. The fibers showed evidence of a tight, crushing tension before decomposition began. This was not an accident of falling. It was an act of brutal, purposeful control. The initial narrative, the one that had held the entire case captive for 8 years, was now completely inverted. The family had not been abducted from their home. They had been forced into a structural element of their home, a method of concealment so audacious, so utterly unthinkable, that it had defied all traditional investigative logic. This was the work of a person, or persons, who knew the house, knew its limitations, and, most disturbingly, knew the Wallace family intimately enough to exploit their deepest vulnerabilities. The shift in the investigation was immediate and tectonic. All focus was ripped away from external, opportunistic criminals and redirected toward the circle of trust, the internal world of the Wallaces, who knew the layout of the house, the exact dimensions of the chimney flue, and the family schedule, who possessed the chilling foresight to not only commit this act, but to also engineer the perfect, misleading crime scene that had fooled experienced investigators for a decade. Detective Sharma, now the sole driving force of the reborn inquiry, began to dissect the lives of Robert and Sarah with surgical precision. Robert Wallace, a quiet, diligent accountant, and Sarah, a part-time librarian, were, on the surface, entirely unremarkable. That was the genius of their disappearance. Their normalcy had made the tragedy all the more unfathomable. But in every life, there are stress fractures, minor points of conflict that, in the white-hot light of a murder investigation, become chasms of motive. The interviews were reopened, but with a new, accusatory lens. Family friends, distant relatives, business associates, everyone who had once offered platitudes of shock and sorrow was now questioned with a quiet, relentless skepticism. The conversations that had been summarized as grief in the original reports were now analyzed for micro-expressions of guilt, for the subtle linguistic clues that only an overwhelming truth can hide. One name, one peripheral figure, began to surface with a persistent, unnerving frequency: David Thorne. Thorne was Robert Wallace's former business partner from a failed, short-lived consulting venture 3 years prior to the disappearance. The partnership had dissolved acrimoniously. The official story at the time was irreconcilable differences in business vision. The reality, as new interviews revealed, was a bitter personal feud over alleged financial improprieties and a small but significant debt of $50,000 that Thorne owed Wallace, a debt that Wallace was on the verge of legally pursuing. The debt, in the context of a wealthy community, was trivial. The betrayal, however, was profound. Thorne, a man whose public persona was one of smooth, effortless success, had a hidden life fueled by resentment and a desperate need to maintain appearances. He was interviewed extensively in 2002. His statements were calm, composed, and utterly devoid of anything helpful. He offered an ironclad alibi, a business dinner in a city 300 miles away, complete with receipts, witnesses, and a hotel check-in. The alibi, a towering edifice of verifiable fact, had instantly cleared him in the minds of the original team. But Detective Sharma saw it differently. She did not see an alibi. She saw a performance. The level of premeditation required for the Chimney concealment suggested a mind that planned not just the murder, but the absolute disappearance of the evidence of the murder. A staged alibi, meticulously constructed 300 miles away, was precisely the act of a mind focused on the total erasure of accountability. It was a move designed for the long game, banking on the inevitable cooling of the case. The physical evidence, though sparse, was also slowly beginning to point a terrible finger at Thorne. A meticulous forensic sweep of the Wallace home in 2010. A second, more detailed sweep that utilized newly developed technology revealed microscopic trace evidence of industrial concrete dust in the fibers of a forgotten welcome mat in the garage, a type of concrete that matched a specific batch used in a construction project managed by one of Thorne's subsidiary companies a few months before the Wallaces vanished. It was an attenuated connection, a wisp of smoke, but it was enough to justify a deeper, more invasive look into David Thorne's life. The story had moved from a tragic, inexplicable vanishing to a dark, personal vendetta. A financial dispute escalated into an act of unfathomable cruelty. The investigation pivoted entirely to dismantling Thorne's meticulously constructed life and his perfect 8-year-old alibi. The hunt was on for the flaw, the single, human crack in the edifice of his deception. The full psychological profile of David Thorne began to emerge, a chilling portrait of a man obsessed with control and appearances. He was not a criminal of passion, but a calculating engineer of reality. The $50,000 debt was not a motive for murder. It was a trigger. The thought of public exposure, of his carefully manicured reputation being tarnished by a legal dispute with his former partner, was, to him, a fate worse than death. He needed the Wallace family to simply cease to exist, thereby eliminating the debt and the threat of public shame. His mind, the investigator surmised, saw the Wallaces not as people, but as a complex, messy problem that required a permanent, elegant solution. The level of premeditation in the crime began to truly sink in. The staged 911 call, which Sarah Wallace had desperately made, was likely engineered by Thorne. The investigators theorized that Thorne, a familiar, trusted figure to the Wallaces, had gained entry under some pretense, a late-night business meeting, a manufactured emergency. The call to the sheriff was not a report of a random shadow, but a final, desperate act of a woman realizing her trusted associate had become a monster. Robert Wallace's rifle, leaning unfired against the counter, was the ultimate symbol of his surprise, the moment his guard had been dropped with a man he once called a partner. Thorne had likely subdued Robert and Sarah swiftly, silently, using a controlled chemical agent or a quick, overwhelming display of force. The children, still sleeping, would have been the easiest targets, their bodies found in their night clothes, a detail of profound, heartbreaking pathos. The concealment, the meticulous packing of 4 bodies into the chimney, required time, specific tools, and a physical exertion that Thorne's alibi made impossible. This led to the ultimate, terrifying realization. David Thorne had not acted alone. The alibi was too perfect, the logistics of the crime too demanding for a solitary actor. Sharma and her team now focused on the people who enabled Thorne, the silent accomplices who allowed the perfect crime to breathe for 8 years. They focused on his closest associates, particularly his former personal assistant, a man named Marcus Lyle. Lyle had been intensely loyal to Thorne, a quiet, almost invisible man who handled the logistics of Thorne's life, including the arrangements for the business trip that formed the core of Thorne's alibi. Lyle's original testimony was a mirror image of Thorne's, brief, clinical, and perfectly aligned with the facts. But beneath the veneer of professionalism, Lyle was a man struggling under a suffocating financial burden, a known gambler with debts that would make him vulnerable to the kind of coercion or incentive that Thorne could easily provide. Sharma authorized a discreet, deep-dive forensic analysis of the travel records and cell phone pings from 2002. The alibi, stated Thorne, was in a hotel 300 miles away at the time of the disappearance. Lyle's records, however, were less clean. While Lyle's company phone was pinging near Thorne's hotel, his personal burner phone, a rarely used device discovered deep in the archived records, was pinging much closer to the Wallace property, making a series of short, 2-minute calls in the hours immediately following the disappearance. The calls were too brief for a real conversation. They were a series of rapid-fire confirmations. The calls were to a decommission number, a dead end. But the timing and the location were catastrophic to the alibi. Lyle had been the logistics man, the one who executed the physical removal and concealment, while Thorne was establishing his perfect narrative distance. Lyle, a man already deep in debt and now implicated in a multiple homicide, was the ultimate open loop. Detective Sharma moved with cold, clinical precision. Lyle was brought in, not for a casual re-interview, but for an interrogation of immense psychological pressure, presented not with speculation, but with the cold, hard data of his phone's geolocation data and the matching industrial concrete dust found at the scene. The weight of 8 years of secrecy, combined with the irrefutable evidence of his presence at the scene, was the final, critical breaking point. The veneer of calm that had characterized the first investigation cracked, then shattered. Lyle confessed, not to the planning, but to the execution. He confirmed the theory. Thorne, under the guise of an urgent late-night meeting, had incapacitated the Wallaces, and then, while Thorne established his alibi, Lyle had worked for hours in the dead of the night, sealing the family into the chimney. His final act, a detail that resonated with a terrible, dark artistry, was carefully placing Robert Wallace's rifle back on the kitchen counter, an act that would scream abandon to the original investigators, cementing the narrative of a chaotic, external flight that never happened. The confession confirmed the darkness, but it did not close the emotional loop. The final piece of evidence, the item that spoke most eloquently of the children's final, desperate struggle, was the tarnished silver locket found clutched in Clara Wallace's skeletal hand. The locket was not just an item of sentimental value. It contained a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch on its back. Forensic analysis revealed that the scratch was not random. It was a minute, hastily etched, followed by a smaller, fainter line, possibly an attempt at The terrifying implication was that, in the moments before her ultimate suffocation, in the absolute darkness of the stone column, the child had desperately tried to inscribe the first initial of the man who had done this to them. She did not scratch the letter of a random intruder, but the initial of a man she knew, a man she called Uncle David. It was a final, silent, articulate accusation that had waited 8 years for the light. The arrest of David Thorne was swift and final, a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a decade of horrific uncertainty. When confronted with Lyle's confession and the new evidence, the concrete, the cell pings, and the heartbreaking final etching from a 7-year-old girl, Thorne remained stoic, refusing to break his character of injured innocence. He offered no dramatic confession, no theatrical display of remorse. His silence, the same cold, manipulative silence that had guarded the truth for 8 years, was his final defense. But the silence, once a shield, was now a damning admission. The narrative of the Wallace family was now complete, a terrible, linear progression from a cheerful family life to a final, desperate confinement in the cold, dark throat of their own home. It was a story of financial desperation, narcissistic rage, and the kind of methodical, cold-blooded cruelty that defies human comprehension. The house, once a silent monument to the inexplicable, was now a public testament to the horrific truth. The mystery of their disappearance was solved, but the deeper, more profound mystery, the question of how a human being could commit such a monstrous act for so small a sum of money, that question remained, a permanent, chilling open loop, a new kind of silence that the world of justice could never truly fill. The courtroom proceedings that followed the confession and arrest were not a search for truth. The forensic evidence and the accomplice's testimony had already established that, but a formal, public accounting of the tragedy. David Thorne, immaculate and chillingly composed, sat through the trial with the same detached, almost clinical demeanor that he had used to deceive the initial investigators. He was a portrait of a man entirely disconnected from the monstrous nature of his own actions. The narrative that unfolded was a meticulous, step-by-step reconstruction of the crime, a forensic analysis of the how that left the emotional why utterly inadequate. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven not by passion or impulse, but by a profound, narcissistic fear of exposure. The $50,000 debt was the spark, but the gasoline was Thorne's all-consuming need for control and the maintenance of a perfect, unassailable public image. The sheer audacity of the concealment. The chimney became the central, horrifying motif of the trial. The jury was walked through the logistics, the terrible physical reality of forcing 4 bodies, 2 of them small children, into the narrow, tapering verticality of a flue. The testimony of Marcus Lyle, the accomplice, was the most damning. He detailed the hours of silent, desperate labor, the use of a simple, motorized hoist, stolen from a construction site he managed, to lift the bodies into the chimney's throat, the methodical application of the quick-setting concrete to seal the bodies into a state of permanent, hidden rest, the deliberate placement of the old wood planks to create a solid barrier that would foil any casual internal inspection. Lyle spoke with a flat, broken monotone, his word to confession not just of crime, but of a total, moral collapse in the face of Thorne's financial power. He confirmed the orchestration of the 911 call, Thorne's final, manipulative act before driving to his alibi hotel. Thorne, he stated, had been on the line with Sarah Wallace, not as a friend, but as a cool, calculating threat, forcing her to utter the words "home intruder" before she was finally silenced. The children, he testified, were sedated, never waking for the true horror of their final minutes. This single detail, the children not experiencing the full terror, was a small, final mercy that offered a tiny sliver of comfort to the extended family, a temporary break in the crushing emotional weight of the evidence. However, the final piece of evidence presented, the silver locket with the child's final, etched accusation, shattered that small comfort. Detective Sharma took the stand, her voice steady but weighted with the gravity of the artifact she held. She described the microscopic D on the back of the locket, the forensic pathologist's certainty that the scratch was made by an external force, the tip of a small, jagged piece of metal or stone, but that the pressure and intent behind the mark were consistent with the child's final, desperate attempt to communicate. It suggested that Clara, despite Lyle's claim of sedation, had been awake, aware, and engaged in a final, furious act of naming her executioner. The image of the 7-year-old girl, trapped in darkness, frantically scratching her killer's initial onto her most cherished possession, was the emotional climax of the trial. It moved the jury beyond the technicalities of forensic analysis and into the raw, heart-rending reality of the crime. Thorne's defense, a predictable barrage of reasonable doubt arguments centered on the lack of direct physical evidence connecting Thorne's person to the scene and the unreliability of an accomplice's testimony, crumbled under the weight of this narrative. The prosecution needed no fingerprint, no stray hair. They had a chilling story of methodical intent and a child's last message. After only 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase was not a moment of justice for the families, but an acknowledgement of a profound, permanent loss. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the grandmother, stood before the court, not to speak of revenge, but to speak of the 8 years of silence, the slow, corrosive certainty that her grandchildren had been lost, only to discover the horrific truth that they had been hidden just yards away from her constant, aching vigil. Her statement was quiet, formal, and utterly devastating, a narrative of maternal grief that transcended the courtroom and spoke to the universal dread of the inexplicable. Thorne was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His reaction was a final, terrifying display of his personality, a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a clinical acceptance of a life he now deemed unfixable, an outward sign that the ultimate loss of his freedom was merely the final, inevitable consequence of a problem that had spiraled beyond his control. The closing of the case did not bring closure to the community. It brought a profound, unsettling knowledge. The Wallace house was eventually torn down. The Chimney, the horrific conduit of the crime, was systematically dismantled and its stones were ground into dust, a final, physical erasure of the structure that had served as both crime scene and tomb. But the psychological scar on the town remained. The story of the family who vanished after reporting an intruder, and whose truth lay dormant in the heart of their own home, became a permanent fixture of local lore. It was a stark, brutal reminder that the greatest threats often come not from the shadows that cross the perimeter, but from the faces that smile across the dining room table, from the people who hold the keys to one's trust and one's home. The case of the Wallace family was not a victory for justice. It was an acknowledgement of a terror that had been present all along, a terror engineered with chilling perfection, a narrative of deceit that had held the entire world captive for 8 years. The silence was finally broken, but the emotional echoes of that chimney and the heartbreaking final inscription of a young girl would continue to reverberate, a permanent, somber truth about the darkest capabilities of the human heart. The final resting place of the Wallaces became a quiet, unmarked plot in the local cemetery, a stark contrast to the dramatic, hidden finality of their initial grave. The quiet of the cemetery, however, was a different kind of silence, a silence of profound, heartbreaking certainty, a silence that finally allowed the family's memory to breathe without the suffocating weight of the unanswerable question. The story of the Wallaces, in its terrible chronology, served as a final, definitive account of the limits of conventional investigation and the limitless capacity for deception. The narrative was closed, but the shadow it cast over the small town remained, a perpetual, chilling reminder of the terror that can be hidden in plain sight.